Yeah, I think the mic is on. Jack, is the mic good? Okay. Yeah, I'm going to use this one. You need that one. Okay. Okay, good.
Hey, we're going to get started now. Jack, are you good? So thank you for coming to Source 2012. This talk is going to be a discussion group around deconstructing the cost of a data breach. And Patrick Florer will be leading this discussion. He's someone who's, I'll let him introduce himself, but I've certainly seen him around in the security metrics and modeling community for some time now.
Yeah, well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, I'm Patrick, as he said, and let me figure out which way to do this. That's a little bit about me. I have come to security from a little bit different direction. Worked in IT for 30-something years doing all sorts of stuff, development, database design, whatnot. Also, along the way, worked for many, many years in evidence-based medicine, which you might not think would have much to do with security, but actually it's a perfect tie-in for risk analysis. I won't bore you with the details. It's where I cut my teeth on statistics, analytics, writing of best practices, evidence-based practices, and a lot of things we do in security. I started off life hoping to be a classical linguist. So this is really going to be a little bit of a talk about language and what it means when we talk about a data breach. I'm really going to go at the sentence, deconstructing the cost of a data breach, starting at the end and working back to the beginning. Since I'm standing here, I get to kind of define the framework, but I really want this to be interactive. And so I'm going to encourage you to participate, raise your hand, interrupt me. My hope is that we will all learn something for having spent these 40 minutes together. And so with that, let me tell you what we're going to talk about. Those 5 things essentially, just in terms of words and concepts. We're really not going to get into actual costs. There are lots of numbers floating around. I really want to talk more about definitions and methodology and how you go about thinking about these things. And so here we go. Let's start with what is a breach. And one of my favorite books is the dictionary. I find it a useful place to start when investigating something. So I'm just going to show you a few definitions in common use of the term breach. For some reason, number 4 keeps jumping out at me. I don't know what the leap of whales has to do with information security, but maybe I'm about to find out this afternoon. But as you see, an opening, a tear, a violation or infraction, a disruption of friendly relations. That's from American Heritage Dictionary, pretty much the same thing from Collins. There's the whale in there someplace, I'm pretty sure. Here's one called dictionary.com. So obviously a breach is a break, a disruption, either physical or of some sort. So what's a data breach? Well, maybe some of y'all can jump in here. There's really no common legally accepted definition that I'm aware of, but maybe some of you guys are, of what constitutes a data breach. Apparently the federal legislation on breach is on hold until the next session of Congress, at least as I understand it. There are definitions in the various state laws about what is personally identifiable information. We'll get to that in a minute. But essentially the law is evolving. You know, the computer age is way ahead of the law. And the fellow last hour mentioned the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act as one of the vehicles by which people are prosecuted for hacking and data breaches. So, any of y'all aware of common definitions, or would you like to, add anything to this? Yes?
If they were to fall short, it doesn't take into account a breach of, for example, email addresses and passwords that can be used to authenticate to a service or a game.
Right. I'm gonna talk about that in a bit, or put that up. Yes.
Personal financial information.
Okay. Okay, fair. Yes. The EU defines personally identifiable information, and in a couple of slides, I'll show you their definition. You know, I didn't look. I don't know. Does anyone know? Yeah, no, the EU tends to get very specific about things. I'll be honest with you, I didn't look, so I should. So that's a very nice point. How many of you all are on the security metrics or CIRA mailing lists by chance? I think it was Richard, how do you pronounce his name, Baitlik, the guy from Mandiant, raised the question the other day about whether data breach is an outdated concept. I believe that was on security metrics, wasn't it? And his point was a data breach tends to imply sort of bounds on the time. And he was talking about a different kind of thing we're seeing a lot of now, which is, he actually called it an advanced persistent threat, where the purpose of the perpetrator is to hide something and exfiltrate data as long as they can get away with doing it. So I guess the question on the table is, do we need more than one term? Does data breach get it done? Is there some new way we need to start thinking about this kind of event? So I'd invite any comments from you guys. Maybe splitting hairs, because you know, when I thought about this, I thought about the TJX breach, which, as I understand it from the public documentation, that actually went on for a period of some months, if not years. I think that's pretty much the common understanding. So.
Why does that time frame matter? I mean, it's more about the data that was taken, not the duration.
I would tend to agree with you. I wasn't really sure what point he was trying to make, except that I think, you know, he's so much into forensics and incident response that nothing else seems to really matter in his book. That's my personal bias on it. So something to think about. You know, agree, it's really the data. I guess what he would say is the intent of the attacker to get in and get the data and get out as fast as possible and be done with it, or is it to stick around and keep stealing new stuff and new stuff and new stuff? So I think both of those are kinds of attacks that we see in the world. So we've talked about breach and data breach. Now I kind of want to talk about what are some of the kinds of data. And I've got at least 6 things I'm thinking of. You all might want to add to the list. And I think a couple of these were mentioned before. I should probably update that earlier slide. But these are all different kinds of things that we have on our systems and that people who shouldn't have apparently have an interest in having. So I'm going to go through these one by one with examples, and you know, we'll want you guys to add to them. These are examples of what I think of as operational data. Maybe the most significant would be certificates, encryption keys, and tokenization data. But it's basically anything that you generate in the course of running your shop that's nobody's business but yours, your company. Do some other things come to mind, or does this list, you know? I know we've got some real experts in the audience here on data breaches. I'm looking at 2 of them over here from the data loss group. So anyway, operational data. So what else, what other kinds of things would be data in a data breach? Intellectual property. It may be that HR data is really more operational, but the point I'm trying to make here about data breach is there's no such thing as a monolithic definition of a data breach. And if you're in the business of analyzing the impact or frequency or really the threats or anything to do, there are dozens of variables that vary from breach to breach. Intellectual property is maybe one of the more interesting ones, one of the ones we probably hear less about. Financial information, this is what came to mind for me. Any other categories you all want to add to this? Okay.
That's the one that's the trickiest, right? So most people don't treat their email addresses like a credit card number, social security number. In fact, if you've given your email address to everyone in that room, you might want a shiny iPad.
Yeah.
So if your email addresses go missing, yeah, there's definitely that spear phishing risk that we all talk about. That is really a breach. Same as phone numbers, right? Every time a phone book is dropped from a doorstep, is that a breach? So I think there's more context around those ones.
Well, I want to talk about the Epsilon breach last year, which is a famous one that comes to mind. And I do have a slide coming up about personal information as opposed to personally identifiable information. And there are really a lot of questions. Like Jake says, it's not just spear phishing, it's the correlation engines. So, depending upon your name, now I have a problem because my name is fairly unique. In fact, I'm the only Patrick Florer in the DFW Metroplex, and I may also be the only one in the whole state of Texas. So, my name very specifically identifies me. So, gray area. Whereas if your name might be John Smith, you have a certain amount of anonymity or disguise in that regard because there could be hundreds of them. So, we'll come.
Jake's problem is further compounded in that if a list of 1,000 email addresses goes out, maybe 500 of those people say, hey, that was my private email address. I don't give it out to everyone. The other 500 are like, well, yeah, you can get it,
Well, that's a great point.
So that there's disparity between the customers on their perception of the data.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Another thing about the phone numbers, some of the information is publicly available. I don't know if this has changed with the Privacy Act. When we went through securing things properly before the Ethernet said go on to court, it doesn't matter if someone's data is publicly available. In the context of, particularly when you're doing financing for a customer, if I, as a customer, give you data which is publicly available, you have an obligation to protect it regardless of what's on the phone. And that was a battle I fought continuously, which is, but they're in the phone book. But no, but they entrusted us with the data. It doesn't matter where it is. And so that's one of those where you can just get in a rattle with whether or not it's a breach. If you're entrusted with it and required to keep it secure, even if it's public data.
That's where I think you get into expectation of privacy.
Yeah.
It gets gray.
Now that's an interesting way to think of it because I'm old enough to remember paper phone books were the only thing, and my name and address and phone number were there for anybody to look up, and they put those things on everybody's front door. Times have changed a little bit, but it's an interesting issue. We'll come back to it in a sec.
Real quick, one other.
Yes, please. Yes. Which, personally I found very annoying because I couldn't get hold of people I needed to. You actually had to pay extra not to be listed in the phone book, as I recollect. Yes.
My final thought on the emails is that there's also another funny nuance, which is the volume of data that typically creates a breach. So for instance, I can go to a website like Spokio.com and look up your home address.
Right.
And we wouldn't consider that a breach from Spokio, but if I went and wrote a bot that represented their entire database, I think we would presume that that was a breach.
Well, then maybe it has to do with intent and unauthorized access, like the lawyer was talking about last time. Other comments? Yes.
Yeah, gentleman in the fine hat brought up one word that's also important, is context. And this is loosely based on a previous breach. So a list of email addresses was leaked out, and people were like, well, it's just a list of email addresses. There's no real names associated with them, but it was a list of email addresses of people that were HIV positive.
Yeah.
So it's still not personally identifiable. It's not quite under HIPAA. It's this like real nebulous gray area that no one really knows how to deal with.
Yeah.
So again, it's about the context of the data as much as what the data is.
So one of the themes we're developing that I probably didn't anticipate, but is a good one, is how many gray areas there are around this subject.
More gray than defined.
Which I think is great because, again, it sounds so simple, the cost of a data breach. What could be hard about that? Well, as we're finding out, there are lots of things that could be hard about that. All right, we went through this one. So Financial information we looked at. Okay, so this is really the issue we've been talking about. What's the difference between personal information and then what's going to come next, personally identifiable information? And so far what we've pretty much been saying is it's kind of a gray area. It depends on context. It may depend upon the intent by which the information, or the means by which the information was acquired. It may also have something to do with the use to which the information is put. Whoops, I went back one too far, sorry. What am I doing? I'm not a very good driver, I apologize. Okay, so this kind of stuff is readily available, I think. Email address, depends. I mean, I agree. I've got like 7 different email addresses, and there are some I give out and some that I don't. Some that I consider more private than others. So I'm sure there are other things. There are just gobs of social networking sites that I don't know about. I don't find social networking sites all that interesting personally. I'm a little bit like Dan Gear. Maybe I'm just going to unplug completely someday. Yes?
As I noticed, social networking sites, where would you place information outside of just your Facebook name? So you have all that data that's being aggregated by Facebook, such as I went to this restaurant, I have these friends, I went to this school, I'm married to this person, I dated this person, all that personal information, where would you put that in the definition of?
I think that's a great point.
You can't put it all under one definition either, because marriage, if you're married to someone, that's available publicly through records in the state, for example. But like you said, the travel data, I checked into this restaurant or whatever, that begins to show a personal history, and it's back into that gray area.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think these are great points for the legislators. So far, at least at the federal level, they seem mostly inclined to dodge the issue. It's what it looks like to me. They just doesn't seem that important.
That's because a room full of information security professionals can't come to an agreement. You think the Congress critters are? No.
Well, so that's one of the motivations for my talk and why I'm interested in language and method. If you think about other disciplines like engineering, medicine, and the law, they have a common vocabulary. Some of the definitions are pretty strange, but at least when 2 doctors start talking about, for example, the left distal ureter, they all know exactly where to cut or do whatever they're going to do. And we've got a ways to go, I think, to establish some common definitions.
Yeah, but carry that analogy forward. Now, as soon as they start talking about a diagnosis of a certain part of the body, then it gets back into, well, no, we disagree on this method or this terminology.
They don't disagree on the terminology, I don't think, but I would certainly agree that they can disagree on the root cause or even what they're looking at. If we had more time, I could tell some stories from my days in evidence-based medicine, just pretty mind-boggling stuff that you would have thought been straightforward. So let me keep going. So here is a definition from a NIST document, or maybe it's OMB, about personally identifiable information. And to be honest with you, looking at this now, in light of the discussion we've been having, I'm not sure this is very helpful at all.
Actually, there's one point of that that's helpful that most people, they focus in on, well, name, social security number, biometric. Look at the words between that. Information which is linked or linkable. I think that becomes the crucial bit. That you got 2 pieces of information, can you link them together to identify someone? If so, then yeah, that becomes PII.
So
You can't use them to link, then it doesn't. It doesn't matter what those 2 pieces of information are.
that's a nice point. So in my case, if you know Patrick and you know Florer, I mean, that's, at least in the city of Dallas, that's going to go right straight to me and to nobody else. And that may also be the case for some of you guys. So what I tend to think about most here is the power of the correlations. You know, what Facebook knows, what Twitter knows, what Google has been able to assimilate. And before too long, I mean, it's literally going to be almost any 2 pieces of information. You know, maybe I like to go eat sushi at a particular restaurant, every Friday night, and I always charge it on my American Express card. You know, yeah, the world is very definitely changing. Here is the EU thing on personally identifiable information, and you know, I'm sure many of you have worked on guidelines and standards committees, or some of you have, and you probably understand that there's kind of a lowest common denominator effect that takes place in a committee, and oftentimes you end up with a language that just doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. It just kind of made it past everybody on the committee. So that's what the Europeans have to say. So let's just talk for a moment about Epsilon. That was about a year ago. For those, if there's anybody in the room needs a little brief, Epsilon is a mass mailing agent, as I understand it. How many people got letters from Epsilon about the breach? How many got more than like 3? Yeah. So how many had ever heard of Epsilon before the breach? Do you work for Epsilon? No? Yeah? Yeah, so, you know, I'd never heard of these guys, and it turns out that they, you know, process gazillions of email mass marketing messages daily. Now, different letters that I received indicated different scenarios. One of them said, they only got your email. I think I got another one that said, got your first name and last name, but no email. And another one said maybe all 3 things. So under the law, I mean, I'm not aware if anybody has sued or prosecuted Epsilon at this point. Anybody know? I had kind of a theory that probably there was contractual language between the customers and Epsilon that said, if you guys screw up, you blast out apology emails, which was an extremely low-cost event for everybody, which is why I think we all got emails. Did anybody actually get a letter? I don't think any were sent out, do you? Yeah, I mean, so, you know, they probably dealt with that in less than a day. Very low-cost event. So was that a breach? Should it have been a breach? What do you guys think?
Like I said, it's hard to know without knowing definitively what data was taken, or if it was a certain list, certain data got taken, less data on another one.
Let's just assume that worst case was name and email address. Let's take them at their word.
For some people, that's a breach.
That's a breach.
Other people, it's not.
So I guess the question then would become, how do you design a law that is sensitive to the fact that given a single event, it would have such a wide range of potential ramifications?
There's 2 numbers you can look at. Number 1, was there a single record that was breached? It was perceived to be private.
Okay.
If 1 or greater, it's a breach. Or they could do the congressional thing and say, well, maybe 51%, not that we would ever be able to determine.
Interesting. Okay.
Also, I think there's a logic for that you're anthropomorphizing Congress.
Could you say that again, please? I couldn't hear you.
We're anthropomorphizing congressmen if we're, you know, trying to make them appear intelligent themselves.
I don't know. You're kind of looking like Abraham Lincoln to me the longer I look at you. But okay. So, sure. Sure.
There's 2 sides. So FERPA is an educational and privacy act, which is for educational establishments.
In the United States? Okay.
So you're allowed to say, my directory information is public information, unless I say it's not.
Okay.
The educational establishments have the responsibility to make sure that information is private.
Interesting. I do know this. Having put 5 kids through college, it was extraordinarily annoying to me to have to pay the invoice for tuition, but never to be able to find out what the grades were. You know, that's just how it works if you haven't been there yet. So, okay, let's keep going. think people are making some great points that this is not an area that's very clear. Now, protected health information, with the passage of the HighTech Act in 2009, some things changed with regard to HIPAA. The fines started to have a little more teeth. The state's attorney general got involved. You may or may not be aware that they have the right to bring an action against an entity that suffers a breach. The FTC got involved, and we got this definition of what exactly is protected health information. And in fact, it got very specific with a list of almost 18, and you'll have to get the presentation to read all this. They define 18 or 20 specific elements that constitute protected health information. There have been, I said I wasn't going to talk much about cost, but there have been a couple of instances in California in the last 2 or 3 years where these breaches have been prosecuted or fined under state law, where even very small medical practices have had fines in excess of $200,000 levied against them for, maybe 8 or 10 illegal views of patient-protected information. Now, from what I understand, if you don't know, it's the Office of Civil Rights for Health and Human Services that is charged with prosecuting HIPAA and HighTech violations for the federal government. And my understanding is that every entity that reports 500 or more records is going to be investigated specifically for whatever they can find. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But, at least there is a laundry list of stuff. And, I'm sure we've all been impacted by HIPAA. My view is that if you or your spouse get sick, what HIPAA primarily does is make it impossible for you to get the health information you need without doing a bunch of paperwork and stuff. Yes?
Who is the bodies that would be investigating that?
It's called the Office of Civil Rights.
Is that a state level or a
No, federal, the Office of Civil Rights of Health and Human Services.
Right, so that's curious, since states vary in their mandatory breach disclosure laws.
Well, that's just who does it at the federal level. HighTech is a federal law.
That's where the notification obligation came in.
Yeah.
Had that HighTech off the notification and ability to fine.
Right. So there are 4 tiers of HighTech fines. You can look it up depending upon the egregiousness of the action. And then the other thing where I think the real teeth is, state attorneys general are authorized to take action. So let's say you're a medical company and you suffer a breach and it involves people in all 50 states. You could be looking at 50 different actions, one from each of the states, and it could pretty quickly become not pocket change. So anyway, let's keep going. We've only got about 10 more minutes according to my clock. I want to talk about just what kinds of costs, and my thinking may be a little different here. I do risk analysis, quantitative analysis, that sort of thing. And I tend to think about costs just in these 2 simple categories. Stuff that you ought to be able to figure out, or if you're in a company, you ought to be able to go to somebody and at least get some rough estimates. And then things that you can't. And I'll give you some examples of each here quickly. All these kinds of things ought to exist somewhere. Now, I'm not saying they're going to necessarily be easy to get out of people, or that information security folks, 5 minutes? Okay. But these are things that at least ought to be quantifiable in some sense. Here's some more. If you get fined, somebody ought to know what you paid. And then here's some things that are really kind of difficult. Quantifying the value of brand or reputation. That's tough. If we have enough time, or if you get the slide deck, there are actually methodologies for estimating these things. There are consultancies in the business of providing valuations of brand. There are different ways people do this stuff. Value of intellectual property, very, very difficult to quantify. There are a number of ways people go at it, but most experts will readily concede that they're kind of guessing, or at least they're establishing a range or a probability distribution. So my opinion is that these things are hard, which doesn't mean they aren't real. It just means that they're hard. Now, here's something I don't hear people talking about much at all when we discuss the cost of a breach. Whose cost? So if you have a big data breach, you know, all of these different people could be impacted. I think most of us know that our individual costs in dealing with our credit histories and protecting ourselves don't count in the courts. And there's a good reason for that. It's because the court, you know, unless you can demonstrate an actual financial loss, the court has no way to know what to give you. Now, I think I read about a statute where maybe some state is imposing a minimum potential award to each individual breach, but it's not much. It's like $50. But I think if you followed the Hannaford suit, there was a class action suit against Hannaford over the breach. The district court threw it out, disqualified everybody in the class except the 2 or 3 people who actually had experienced a fraud. But then the appellate court reversed, and I'm not sure what the current status of that case is. So, you know, for example, in a big breach, when the FBI and the Secret Service come in, they experience costs. Those costs are footed by all of us, the taxpayers. So I think it's important when you're evaluating a breach to be sure whose point of view you're looking at it from. Most typically, we're thinking about the point of view of the breached entity and not so much the consumers or customers, but all of these people are impacted, and probably some others. How do we measure and estimate costs? This is maybe kind of controversial. It's also difficult. Some of the reports we read just give us overall costs. This breach cost $2 million. We don't really know how that was derived. Some reports are based on per record costs. That's a metric, it seems to me, that works pretty well for some types of breaches but not others. So one record of intellectual property, let's say, that happened to be the proprietary designs for the 787 Dreamliner, certainly has a very different value than one record of credit card information. I'm still working on some models for these things, and maybe you all have some ideas, but it seems to me that there are some costs that scale by the number of records and some that don't. So, comments or questions about this? These are just some things you might want to research. These are methods people use for valuing intangibles like intellectual property and brand damage. Notice I haven't said a word about stock valuation. It was on my list earlier of things that are hard to talk about. For a while, people in information security said, well, TJX's stock got hammered. Heartland's stock got hammered. It did immediately after, but now it's up about 600%. So you have to be really careful with those things. That's the only thing I would say.
Yeah, you have to qualify stock got hammered for what time frame.
Right.
And then you have to also look at more than 1 or 2 examples, which I believe the recent paper was all about that breach.
Heartland, it was Gunnar Peterson, wasn't it?
Right. They didn't cover, for example, like hundreds of companies to show that was truly a trend or a one-off.
I think the point I would like to make is when you think about these things, just be careful. Be judicious, be thoughtful. It's not a straightforward, clear picture, and you could embarrass yourself. So we're getting close to the end, which is, how do we know about all this stuff? Well, these 2 guys here, Jericho and Jake Coons, are part of the Data Loss Project. So we'll come to them in a minute. But, here are a lot of ways. One of my favorite sources for researching breaches for public companies are the SEC filings. You have to be careful with the SEC filings. You really have to follow them over a period of years because companies will set aside money to cover anticipated costs, and then they'll pay things, they'll reach settlements, and so the numbers are continually moving up and down. But if you're patient and you dig deeply enough, you can usually get a picture of what something costs. So, for example, TJX admitted in its SEC statements, as best I can follow, somewhere between $170 and $190 million of actual out-of-pocket costs before you even get into CapEx and lost opportunity and stuff like that. So disclosure laws, especially this new SEC guidance, are you all familiar with that? Issued a few months ago that publicly traded companies, if they experience a breach that is considered to be, here's a slippery word, material, are required to disclose in their quarterly and annual filings. I won't get into the long discussion of what material means. There's some pretty humorous stuff you can find about if you don't belong to the Guild of Magicians, you have no right to express an opinion about what material means. Those magicians generally have like CPA after their names. No offense, my dad was a CPA. Yes?
Can you jump back on slide?
Yes, gladly.
I want to make one important point. Disclosure laws, state breach laws, they vary wildly. The opposite side of that is we have to send in Freedom of Information Act requests to get those records. And the states that don't have very refined laws, they don't specify who gets the reports.
Yeah.
So it's basically like, well, we had a breach, we'll send it to the Attorney General. Another one will be like, well, we'll send it to this agency or whatever.
So maybe you can shed some light on something I've been wondering about. About 3 years ago, the state of Maine published a fantastically detailed, useful breach report where they broke out the cost to financial institutions in Maine, TJX, Hannaford, and all others. Do you remember that report?
I don't think I read it.
Oh my gosh, it was incredible. It was everything you could possibly want if you wanted to research a breach. Of course, it was only the financial institution's costs, but it was kind of an interesting perspective. It's what really got me thinking along the lines of whose costs are we talking about? But they don't do it anymore. Yes?
Since we're here in Massachusetts, one of the laws, the 201 CMR 17 here, there's an extra piece of what's a breach and when you have to notify, what's the cost, which is that anyone that I've spoken to who does not work for our Attorney General has one reading of the law, or the regulation, excuse me, and the AG's office, specifically Scott, who's responsible for prosecuting, has a much more strict read of it. Any sentient human being would read there is effectively, although they don't use the term, a safe harbor for encryption in Massachusetts. The Attorney General's office does not believe there is a safe harbor for encryption for laws PII under 201 CMR 17. So we're just adding shades of gray here because there's what common sense says, including attorneys, and then there's what you're going to be prosecuted with. So, for example, is it a breach if you do not lose key material and encrypted data is lost? Most of us would say no. If you're confident key material is not lost. The state of Massachusetts does not believe that anyone can, under any circumstances, state that key material is safe, and therefore encrypted data when lost must be reported.
I think it's going to take a new generation of lawyers, basically.
We are here, in the hallowed grounds of cranking out attorneys.
Yeah. I just have one or two more slides. I know I'm a few minutes over, but I wanted to talk about just a couple of other sources. So here's some research projects that are out there. There are all sorts of published reports. I'm sure there are 5 times as many as I listed. I just put down on the list the ones that came to mind probably the most. And I actually work pretty closely with him, and I don't know what well, I do know what he charges for certain kinds of reports, but that's not going to be part of my I'm not going to tell you.
Full disclosure, man. Come on.
Nope. And then, of course, there are the non-public sources, and really there are sources like this, conferences where we get together and talk. The most interesting one to me are these ISACs. The Information Sharing and Analysis Centers is what I believe that stands for. And the FS ISAC, Financial Services ISAC, is probably maybe the most important one of those. They actually put on a schmaltzy convention every year where, I mean, it's kind of like a mini RSA in some fancy resort. So anyway, folks, that's what I have. There's the reference for SurveyMonkey. I want to thank you for taking the time. I want to thank you for your participation. And I am hopeful that maybe you have some things to think about. Questions, comments? Okay, I guess we're done.
Thank you.
Okay.